Good evening for those in Europe and good morning for those in America. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Fundación Cañada Blanch, I want to thank once again to Professor Andrés Rodríguez Pose for being the director and the organizer of this fantastic workshop that we have had these last 3 weeks. And also I will give the welcome to Paolo Veneri, that he's speaking today from Milan. And the thing is that, he works normally in Paris, but today he's speaking from Milan, as I told you. I want to thank also to people that work on communication at the Cañada Blanch Center in London, which is Ginés, and Roberto here in the main headquarters of the Fundación Cañada Blanch in Valencia, Spain. Paolo Veneri, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for joining. And we are looking forward to pay attention and to your presentation, and we will raise questions later on. I pass the microphone to the director of this course, the Professor Andrés Rodríguez Pose, that all our audience knows that he holds the chair of Princesa de Asturias at the London School of Economics, and also he's the director of our center at the LSE. Thank you, Andrés. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Juan, and good afternoon and welcome to everyone to this third and final meeting of the 2021 Cañada Blanch Forum. Today, we have Paolo Veneri to go more into the regional dimension of the current pandemic after 2 sessions focused mainly on the urban dimension, and to talk about regional disparities in a post-pandemic world. The COVID-19 pandemic has combined with other megatrends such as digitalization, aging, climate change, and urbanization to change the economic, the social conditions, and the well-being across all countries in the world, and in particular in OECD countries that seem to be more advanced in this transformations. This has important implications for interterritorial inequality and the tensions that might generate. Paolo will look into how different factors of resilience to external shocks are distributed across regions and cities, the impact of digitalization, the preparedness of health systems to face crisis, the changing economic structure, and environmental conditions are factors that he's going to deal with and that are defining the way the world is going to be working in what we hope is going to be a soon-to-be post-COVID-19 setting, especially hoping that the vaccination drive is going to continue the way it's going right now and is going to expand in many parts of the emerging and developing worlds. Let me just introduce Paolo in a few words. Paolo Veneri is the head of the Regional Analysis and Statistics Unit at the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. His work covers several topics connected to urban and regional development, including understanding and measuring urbanization, well-being, and spatial inequalities. He has led several OECD flagship publications, many of which have had a significant impact, including Cities in the World, a new perspective on urbanization, which he led in 2020, Regions at a Glance and Divided Cities in 2018, The Geography of Firm Dynamics in 2017, Making Cities Work for All in 2016, and one of my favorites, which is one that I participated and enjoyed very much reading afterwards, How's Life in Your Region of 2014, on top of Rural and Urban Partnerships and Integrated Approach to Economic Development in 2013. He holds a PhD in economics and has published numerous papers in academic journals, meaning that he's not just working as a practitioner and advising governments through his daily job at the OECD, but he has a much broader interest pushing the boundaries of our knowledge in the fields of urban economics and regional studies. The format we will follow is very close to that which we followed last week with Evelyn van Leuven. Paolo will start with a presentation before proceeding to have a dialogue with me and addressing any questions that you may have during his presentation or afterwards. Hence, I would encourage you not to forget to post your questions to Paolo during his presentation, or at any time during the discussion that is going to follow in the Zoom chat that you'll have below. So without further ado, Paolo, the microphone in this case is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres, and good afternoon, everybody, first of all. And before starting, wanted to thank you, Andres, and the Fundación Cañada Blanch for inviting me to share with you some of the findings of our recent work. Hope you will find it interesting. So just to start with, my presentation will be about regional disparities. And I just now try to share my screen. I hope you see the screen correctly. Andres, you can give me a sign.
Yes, without any problems.
Good. Today's presentation is about regional disparities from a broad perspective, broad in several respects. First of all, because what I will present is about findings from, let's say, an international comparative perspective, and in particular, as I work at the OECD, I will present findings that are mainly covering OECD member countries, so the developed world in a sense. And I will cover the topic of regional disparities in the framework of the current situation, so the framework of the pandemic. And in particular, I'll just to give you a little bit of a structure of the speech. Will be first of all focusing on the spatial impact in terms of health, so on the health impact of the pandemic and its let's say spatial characteristics. So how the pandemic spread and what was the health impact, how it was distributed across regions, across places in OECD countries. After that, we look at what were the conditions of regions before the pandemic. So how prepared were regions to face the pandemic, and in particular, we'll focus on some of the aspects that might have played a role also in terms of how regions had to pay the health cost of the pandemic, health in terms of unfortunately human losses. And then after that, we'll go through the issue of the regional economic disparities. And so from the health to the economic crisis that the pandemic actually, in a sense, generated. And I will show you some facts that can help us reflecting on the future of regional disparities. And in particular, I will combine the reflections on the pandemic with other mega trends that are actually now very in this moment very important, like urbanization, aging, digitalization, and these different mega trends can have spatial implications that are important for us to reflect on the regional disparities. So what I will present in a few words are mainly facts that we can observe, that we can measure, to reflect together on something that we don't know yet. So we don't know how will be how the regional disparities will evolve in the future, but we will try to I will try to put together some of the facts that can help us discussing at the end of the presentation, different possible views on the evolution. So most of the facts that I will present are part of our recent publications, and in particular the regional outlook that was launched earlier this month by the OECD, or Regions and Cities at a Glance, 2020 edition, about 6 months ago. Just a couple of slides only will be about ongoing works that are still unpublished. So I will flag that so that you can take it with more caution when I talk about that. So I will start with looking at the health cost of the pandemic. And in particular, we'll focus on one specific indicator that we selected to measure the health impact of the pandemic, which was the excess mortality. So we looked at number of deaths in OECD regions. And we are talking about deaths for all causes, not deaths related to COVID only, but deaths for all causes, because this is an indicator that is the most robust when we make international comparisons, because it is not sensitive, in a sense, differences in the way we measure, let's say, and countries report the COVID cases. So a few facts to start with. If you look at 2020, and we compare 2020 with the average of the two previous years, 2019, 2018, for example, we observe that has been in OECD countries 14% more deaths in this year. Which means that for the entire set of the 37 OECD countries means about 1.5 million more deaths. So a huge human huge impact in terms of human costs, human losses. But what we want to focus here is on the spatial dimension of it, so on the regional dimension. We have very large disparities within countries on where the health costs, hit, harder. In particular, the within country differences across regions have been larger than the differences between countries on average. And the indicator that we use here is the excess mortality. So the change, percentage change in mortality with respect to the average of the previous 2 years. And this share is on average 17 percentage points different across the regions of the same country, on average within OECD countries. This has this huge impact, and this high variation between regions has actually triggered many scholars or researchers to look at what determines also the impact of the health costs, also at the subnational level. But still, there are only a limited number of studies to our knowledge, that do that from an international comparative perspective. And actually one of those is also by Andres, and we had the chance to discuss it together in another webinar. So today we have also we collected more recently also data on the vaccination campaign. I won't focus much on that because it's not the. But just before continuing presentation, just wanted to see that this data was also is becoming available. The OECD is collecting it. We are collecting it, and on the vaccination campaign, we actually observe kind of lower disparities. That's going a bit more homogeneously within countries, which is an indication also to make that this effort is to make let's say vaccine universal. In some federal countries, of course, specific regions, specific states are managed also to identify specific priority group in a targeted way, in a customized way, in a sense. But going back to the excess mortality. So if you look at 2020, what was the impact? So if you take OECD regions, we have about 350 regions, which we call large regions. So if we take this region, about 5% of these regions had no increase in excess mortality, only 5%. Then we have a distribution in terms of impact. We have 1/5 of regions, so about 20% of regions that had more than 20% higher deaths compared to the previous years. And we have 8% of regions that had a very high impact, so more than 30% of mortality during 2020 compared to the rest of the countries. On average, we saw that among the hardest hit regions, which also this happened in particular during the first wave, many of the hardest hit regions were large cities, so regions hosting large cities, like for example New York in the US, Milan in Lombardy, or Madrid, Mexico City, where regions that were hardly hit by the pandemic. And on average, since we tend to classify small regions according to their typology, they can be, for reporting statistical indicator, we classify regions in either metropolitan regions or non-metropolitan regions, which are close to a metropolitan area, or more remote regions. So the metropolitan regions, so those regions where we have a large city within that, tended to be more affected, especially during the first wave. Then afterwards, let's say in the last part of the 2020, we observed a kind of a sort of convergence process in terms of health impact of the pandemic. This is a map that is up to date up to December 2020. Again, it shows the change, so the increase in mortality with respect to the previous 2 years. And you can see that in most of the OECD countries, with the exceptions of, let's say, Oceania, Australia, Japan, where the impact was lower, but I mean, in many of the other OECD countries, we see that we have in most regions more than between either 10 or 20%, or between 20 and 30% of increased mortality in specific part of Central America, and in specific regions in Spain and Northern Italy. We see that the impact was particularly high, as you probably know. So now we wanted to explore a little bit more in depth what were the some of the factors that could be associated to higher impact of the virus. So, and in particular, we look at what were the conditions of regions before the pandemic hit. And we found out that not all regions were equally prepared to face the health crisis for a number of reasons, a number of factors. And in particular, what we looked at, or we can distinguish a set of characteristics, of regional characteristics, of aspects that we have looked at. First one is the health systems and the preconditions, so the health infrastructure that were present in regions, but also the health conditions of the population, the pre-existing health condition of the population in that regions. So we collected data in this respect to analyze that, but also, of course, other more general demographics and socioeconomic characteristics. What's the demographic structure of the regions, whether there is a very high share of elderly people, for example, and and also the levels of development of regions can be important. Then we have, of course, more, let's say, physical and geographical characteristics like density, like more physical characteristic of the region, and finally some more institutional and aspects related to policy, like, for example, the extent to which there was a decrease in mobility. It was imposed by the country, or the trust in government to proxy the quality of government, for example. So these are the factors that we have explored. And to start with, in terms of health system and health infrastructure. So one first point is that the availability of hospital beds, we have looked at it since the last 2 decades. And of course, now, if you look at the availability of hospital beds per 1,000 inhabitants, we see that this is not homogeneously, let's say, available, these hospital beds across countries, but also within countries. On average, for example, metropolitan regions have significantly more higher availability of hospital beds per capita than remote regions, which can be a gap that, in the case of an important pandemic, can play a role, of course. But what is most probably interesting is the change, also what happened during the last 2 decades. So if we look at since 2000 up to before the pandemic, our latest point in time, in this case is 2018, we see that let's say, all metropolitan regions, yes, had higher levels of hospital beds per capita, but the change has been important in the sense that practically all OECD countries have reduced during these 2 decades the number of hospital beds, But this is also related to a general change in approach with healthcare. But there has been a concentration of this availability in metropolitan regions. In fact, the chart that you see on the left shows that across all the different types of regions, the large metropolitan regions, so the metropolitan regions with a city of at least 1.5 million inhabitants, is the only type of regions that has seen an increase in the availability of hospital beds. All the others have been declining since 2000. I mean, a similar indicator that we look at is, for example, the availability of doctors, most simply the doctors. Here, the highest availability, consistently with the previous slide, is often found in the capital regions. And in terms of these indicators, we also see that there is quite a substantial variation across regions. For example, while we have on average 4.4 doctors per 1,000 inhabitants, we have a difference of 2.3 doctors across regions within the same country on average. And of course, there are the situation is heterogeneous across countries, but just to give you, let's say, the intuition that that these are aspects that tend to change across regions within the same country. Then, when it comes to health, it is also important to look at the morbidity or the health conditions of the population in each region, which we know also from the literature that can make the population more vulnerable to a pandemic. So in this respect, and I mean, in Regional Cities at a Glance, I mean, we published on this aspect, and you can go into more detail. But now here I just show the obesity rate. We also collected data on other types of diseases at the regional level for the number of OECD countries. And we see here again that that these health conditions can vary as well quite significantly within countries. In some specific regions, for example, when you look at obesity, we have I mean, the share of people with suffering from these problems for more than 40% of the population in some specific regions. So of course, these regions can be more vulnerable in terms of the population to a pandemic. Another factor, another aspect that among the factors that we have seen is, for example, the environmental quality. There have been some works, some studies, recent studies published in the recent months that have demonstrated that the environmental condition, in particular the pollution of the air, for example, is associated to the impact of the spread of the virus or to the health impact of the pandemic. Here we have the possibility of relying on our own estimations by the OECD at the city level. This is a map on functional urban areas, so our definition of metropolitan areas in all OECD countries, where we show the levels of PM2.5 concentration in the air. And here the map shows both the levels and I don't know if it's too small to see, but there are also the shape of the marker in the map shows whether there's been an increase or a decrease in the air pollution during the last decade. And in this respect, this is a factor, as I said, that has been associated by other studies to the impact of the COVID-19. And we know now from our estimation that at the city level, at least in 30 countries out of the 37, there is at least one city with average air pollution levels above the recommended levels by the World Health Organization. It is true that these air pollution levels have improved actually in the last 10 years in most countries. And now, I mean, high-income countries are doing much better than other world regions. But still, I mean, there is work to be done, and this is aspects that can play a role also in the short term for the impact of the pandemic. Then, as we know, we also know that age is an important determinant. Is a factor that can be associated, can that make people more vulnerable to the pandemic. And as we know, also aging is a process that, in a sense, is happening everywhere in OECD countries, but in some places more than others. And in particular, we know that elderly dependency rate tend, for example, which is an indicator of the dependency on, in terms of also economic dependency from the elderly population. This is kind of lowest in metropolitan regions compared to other types of regions. And you see from the chart that, especially in the more recent years, I mean, this has the elderly dependency rate has been increasing in more in remote regions. So finally, before showing you some of the results of this analysis, we have been looking at the Google data. Google mobility data published this year in some regional disaggregation of the index of mobility, which we have reclassified according to our regional classification. And we saw that in many countries, the mobility of people, also probably due to the lockdown measures imposed by the governments during the pandemic, but the mobility has declined suddenly when the pandemic started, also due to the lockdowns. But the decline was relatively higher in large metropolitan regions than in other types of regions, which would possible interpretation of this is that we suspect that the labor, let's say the work mobility to workplace decline more in large metropolitan regions, because in these regions it is probably easier to do remote working compared to other places. And we'll go to the topic of remote working afterwards in a few slides. So what did we find in this analysis? So what were the different indicators, the different characteristics, place-based characteristics that were associated to higher excess mortality? I was saying that this particular slides show what were the factors that were associated to higher mortality rates, and take it with a bit of caution, because it's a bit preliminary. This is still unpublished, but still wanted to share that with you. So the characteristics. So we have done analysis across the different countries, looking at the initial characteristics of regions and how these were associated to higher or lower excess mortality. So we know that having a weaker health system capacity, so an index created with the hospital beds and the doctors per capita, was associated to higher excess mortality, and the same thing happened with a higher population density. Density is a factor that in history has been associated with the spread of virus in pandemics, and this is also the case in our data. It's confirmed also this time for this specific pandemic that we are living. So this association was observed during all the phases of the pandemic. We looked at it on the monthly, let's say, level, and I mean across all the period that was maintained. Then we have looked at trust in government, which proxies institutional quality, and also the share of elderly population, and these two are also factors associated to higher mortality rates, but more during the first wave. And then the air quality, as we see that actually more polluted regions were associated to higher mortality rates. In particular, after in let's say later stages of the pandemic, when it was spread in a larger number of regions, and we see an association also in our case in our data between air pollution and mortality. Then finally, we also look at the mobility through a panel specification. So in this case, we looked over time. So, and what we found is that in places where there was an effective, let's say, lower reduction in home to work mobility, the mortality was higher. In a sense, this might suggest that lockdown measures have been effective in preventing the spread of the virus and therefore the increase in mortality, because we see with the 2 months of delay an association with the mortality rates across the regions in OECD countries. Now, the health crisis turned into an economic downturn, and here the economic downturn could, in principle, be even exacerbating long-standing, persistent regional disparities. In particular, last year, the OECD, our team had produced some estimations on the share of jobs at risk from the lockdowns. With all the restrictions, there were some sectors, including tourism, including retail, including other sectors that were particularly hit by the containment measures. Together with the economics department that provided, let's say, an estimation of the sectors that were most hit, we produced regional estimations on the share of jobs that, not job losses, but jobs that were at risk of, let's say, more vulnerable to the containment measures. And we estimated that here in this case also there were very large regional disparities in terms of this risk of job losses, because there were places with more than 35% of jobs at risk and other places with share of jobs at risk lower than 15%. Many tourist destinations were among the places with with the red flag, in a sense, with the highest jobs at risk, and also several capital regions, actually. We also observed data on tourism trends, and actually we saw that especially the tourism declined in a dramatic way, but in particular in capital regions. So tourism in capital regions, in large cities, actually suffered the most. Now, to look at about these trends and how they can affect the regional disparities, it's important to put into perspective the trends that we were seeing in regional economic disparities before the pandemic. In particular, an important aspect of the regional economic disparities, which are the fact that regional economic disparities are persistent. Are persistent over time. If you look at the last 20 years, we see that they have not changed dramatically, the regional disparities. The charts that you see in this slide show the dotted lines. It's an indicator that measure the overall regional disparities across all OECD countries pulled together. Okay, so it's a very general and international measure of regional disparities in GDP per capita that we measure through the TL index. The good point is that we can disaggregate this regional economic disparities in a part that is between countries, so which is explained by the fact that in one country is richer than another country, and a part that is within country. So what is interesting for us in this case is especially the within country component, which is the light blue line. And here we have two versions of the graph. One version on the left where we look at large regions. So, for example, in the case of France, we have Île-de-France. This is a large region. So, in Lombardy is another large region. Or the panel on the right, which show the same trends but for small regions. For example, the département in France and the provinces in Italy, just to make an example. Or in Spain, the large regions would be let's say, the comunidades autónomas, and the small regions are the next layer. So we see that the way in which we assess regional disparities also depends on the scale. So we need to make sure that we are that we put into perspective in a robust way. But we see that if we look at within country disparities at the large regional level, we see that it's the dark blue line. I wanted to say that the regional disparities have been stagnating, have been constant over time. If we look at the small regions, we see that they have been increasing actually. So over the last 2 decades, regional economic disparities across all OECD countries have been either stagnating or even increasing, depending on the scale at which we look at. The more detail we go geographically, the more we observe and we can capture the trends, the special trends that we see. But the situation is very heterogeneous. For example, if you look at this phenomenon by country, disaggregating country by country, that we see that no matter the scale that we consider, we have approximately half of the countries that have experienced a decline and half of the countries that experienced an increase in regional disparities. So focusing on the smallest scale, we can see one of the drivers of these regional disparities, more than the drivers, let's say one aspect that reflects the current trends, which is the fact that we see a difference in terms of GDP per capita trends between regions that are metropolitan regions, so regions with the large cities inside, so the black line and the dark blue line, which are metropolitan regions and regions close to metropolitan areas, so that are nearby, and regions that are more remote. So in the last decade, there have been the gap increased by 3 percentage points. The gap in terms of percentage point of difference with respect to the metropolitan regions. There's been a decline of 3 percentage points since 2008. So now with the COVID-19, what happened? That we saw that there's been lockdown. There have been strong containment measures that have put some jobs at risk, as we saw just a few moments ago. And there's been a massive shift towards remote working in many professions, in many jobs. The problem is that the remote working is not as easy. It's not equally easy across places, not only across countries but also within countries. So what we did is that we estimated the potential of remote working for each individual regions in OECD countries. So you see the panel on the left in this slide. So you have for each country the regions with the share of jobs that are amenable to remote working, with the lowest share of jobs amenable to remote working, and the region with the highest share of jobs amenable to remote working. So what you see is that the top regions, so those regions where the share of jobs that can be done from home is, is mainly highest often in capital regions or in large cities. If you look, for example, London, Canberra, Stockholm, Zurich, Île-de-France in the case of France. So you see in most countries, the capital or the largest cities is almost always the region where jobs that are amenable to remote working are higher share. We also classified. We did the same approach, and we did it by degree of urbanization. So by classifying, actually, this is done at a much finer spatial resolution. We define consistently using the same definition across countries. We distinguish cities, towns, and semi-dense areas, and rural areas. Okay, and you see that consistently across countries, cities have always the higher share of jobs amenable to remote working. This is, of course, can be a very important factor of resilience for cities and regions when the pandemic hit and there was suddenly an unexpected lockdown that actually imposed, activities to continue in virtual form. The way in which we estimated this potential for remote working is by looking at the type of occupations that are available in each region, in the sense that we classified according to specific studies in the literature that are already published. We classified occupations on the basis of the extent to which it is possible to perform that occupation in remote. So if you consider, for example, a waiter at a restaurant, that cannot be, for example, performed in remote. If you look at an academic researcher, it's a profession which most of the tasks that he performs can be done in remote mode. So in this type of approach, this is an estimation of the maximum share of jobs that could be amenable to remote working. But when we look at the potential for remote working, only looking at occupations, we should also consider that there can be constraint, because workers can have a job that is amenable to remote working, but does not have the possibility of performing that in remote. And in particular, I'm talking about the digital infrastructure and the connectivity of places, which is different within countries. According to our most recent publication documenting this, we see that that rural areas in most countries still reach the digital divide. For example, 1 in 3 households in rural areas does not have access to high-speed broadband on average, and only 7 out of 20 countries actually have succeeded to ensure high-speed connection to more than 80% of the rural regions. So these are important aspects when it comes to consider the possibility of doing the remote working, the resilience of regions during the economic resilience of regions during the time of the pandemic, especially in the hardest, let's say, periods. And the infrastructure is not the only factor that when it comes to the digital aspect, but we also need to consider the skills of the population to use digital devices and to be connected and to change the way in which they were performing their job. For example, in OECD countries, we collected data on the minimum digital skills, so the share of people using internet or not using internet, and we see that on average within country there is a 10 percentage point in the share of people that with the higher and with the lowest use of internet on average. Now, the pandemic was not only, so if you want to reflect on the future of regional disparities, so you need to look at the persistent aspect. Okay, so what is going on since at least a couple of decades or more, but also the impact of the pandemic. But in addition to that, also other megatrends that are important to consider nowadays. In particular, I mentioned before the aging that is affecting different types of regions, but also other aspects. One of these is often mentioned when it comes to looking at the entire world, or especially to developing countries, and which is urbanization. So we have been observing through a recent project that we have done on measuring urbanization in a consistent way across countries using the degree of urbanization and the functional urban areas. By applying this concept, we could observe that that the population, people living in cities have increased much faster during the last 4 decades than people living in other types of settlements like rural areas or towns and semi-dense areas. And the projections that we have, projections in this case are produced by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, tell us that cities will continue to increase more in terms of population than other types of places. This is an important point to consider when we need to reflect on regional disparities. But this slide that you see and these figures that I gave, these are for the entire world. Okay, so far we have been talking about OECD countries only, but this is a global phenomenon. So of course we know that in many other regions of the world, the more developing world, for example, urbanization goes much faster. But if we focused we go back to the regional countries, then we see that if you look at the last 10 years only a short period of 10 years, and we look at the change in the share of people living in different types of regions, then we see that metropolitan regions, in a situation of population stagnation in OECD countries mainly, because there has not been a huge demographic increase. In that situation, I mean, the share of people living in metropolitan regions have increased in practically all OECD countries, and it's the only type of regions that have been increasing in terms of share of population. All the other types of regions, like remote regions or regions characterized by only small and medium-sized cities, they have either been maintained the share of population that they had, or they have been even declining in terms of share of population. So this is also something. So urbanization happens everywhere, not happens differently in OECD countries at different pace, but has been continuing so far, at least, to concentrate people in cities and large metropolitan areas. Urbanization, aging, another megatrend, climate change. Climate change is another aspect that can have a symmetric effect in terms of spatial disparities for several reasons. I mean, we have a number of domains that we could consider for climate change. Now here, I'll just show you, I mean, the increase in temperature that have been asymmetric across places. Cooling needs, which is a measure of increase in temperature, I mean, has been asymmetric across OECD countries and even within countries, and in particular areas has been faster. But in the last 40 years or more, there have been an increase in 25% of these cooling degree days. So it's an important change in terms of temperature. Similarly, if you look at the let's say another aspect, that is the tree cover loss. Tree cover loss here, again, we measure it at the level of metropolitan areas or functional urban areas. And here we see that there's been in half of the cities in OECD countries, there's been a decline in tree cover, and this share actually increased to 3/4 of the cities if we look at large cities only. Of course, as expected, the decline in tree cover has been higher for cities that are growing fast in terms of population, as expected. Now, when it comes to climate change, we need to look at emissions because emission is a crucial aspect of this, and because policies are currently in place in many countries to transition to a zero net carbon economy, and this we know that it can have these policies or this transition more generally can have asymmetric economic effect across regions. For example, I mean, in our publication, the Regional Outlook, OECD Regional Outlook, which was launched a couple of weeks ago, shows that in OECD countries, about 2.3% of employment is in sectors that are at risk of employment losses from the climate policies. But in some regions, this can be up to 6% or even more in specific areas, depending on the sectors in which regions are specialized. If we distinguish types of regions, we see also challenges and opportunities. In metropolitan regions, you see from the from the panel on the left, we see that the drivers of the emissions in metropolitan regions is mainly industries, the power sector, and power sector is particularly important. While the power sector is can be an opportunity in the remote regions and the more kind of in the more remote regions, as you see in the panel on the right, which provides currently the greatest contribution to the generation of electricity through renewable sources. So in this respect, these regions are have a potential to exploit. Now, I will close now the presentation just by saying that we had some lessons from the COVID crisis. So the role of governments, both national governments that needs to set the strategies and guidelines, but also other governments in the interaction between the different levels of government, especially for empowering local actors. The support for policies for recovery from the COVID-19 should be targeted, should be place-based, and should be coordinated. This is the main message. Also important to highlight the measures to face and to manage the megatrends. So the measures that should be consistent with the transition to a climate neutral economy. The importance of data to monitor the situation, and the importance of infrastructure, in particular the digital ones that I just mentioned. Now, to conclude, some of the factors, and to summarize what the many things I showed here, to better adapt to megatrends and external shocks, regions and cities should look at many aspects, and but there are some that we highlighted here in this presentation, where well-functioning digital infrastructure, the skilled labor force, which would and an advanced economy, which would help all the aspects of remote working that we saw, environmental quality for health and well-being, which will make places even more attractive now that remote working will be more important than in the past, but also capacity to provide public services, solid public finance, and so on. And I think I will stop here and leave the time for questions and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Paolo. That was a very interesting presentation. We have had quite a few people already asking whether that presentation can be shared after the end of this debate. So thank you very much. I'm going to start asking, because you raised quite a lot of questions. So it's very difficult to actually look into where to start and where not to start. But let me start with one that is dear to my heart, this whole idea of remote working. And what is the future for some regions? Your work has been pioneering this idea of measuring the capacity of different parts of the world to actually work remotely. And then you find, and when we look at the data that you have produced, we find that in a country like Spain, we are mostly at the bottom of the ranks. That a region like the Balearic Islands, that is highly dependent, a relatively rich region in Spain, but highly dependent on tourism, that 20% of the people that can actually remote work. And because in Spain, the ratio of remote working reality to potential remote working, we have that is 50%. It's probably that about 10% of that population can remote work in reality. So what is, in a world where you're highlighting that probably remote working is here to stay, what is the future for regions like the Balearic Islands, where the capacity to remote work is very, very limited? And when you include that, I look at all the countries that are below the average of the OECD, and they are Turkey, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Romania, Spain, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Italy, Poland, Croatia, and Portugal, on top of Canada and the US, which are there, and was a surprise for me. All Southern European and Eastern European countries. Are we not going to see a greater polarization as a result of this trend?
Thanks for the question. I think that this estimation of potential of remote working is, I mean, again, the name of the indicator is the remote working potential. I mean, does not necessarily say that having lower potential means decline. Actually, the highest share, so highest potential of remote working, tend to reflect the structure of the region in terms of occupations. No, so generally we observe that, as we saw from the slide, the capital regions where, I mean, most of the advanced sector is concentrated as the highest potential of remote working. But this represents a source of possible resilience. So in a sense, a sort of insurance and a buffer when the pandemic hit, in a sense that these jobs, I mean, could continue, I mean, also in remote, but it's not the only part, is not the only aspect that we should look at. First of all, because as we saw from data that we recently collected from specific countries, for example, Portugal, I mean, the share of potential remote workers can be very different from the share of actual remote workers. For example, in the case of Portugal, we see that on average, 1/3 of the share that we estimate to be the maximum number of teleworkers, but those who actually telework at the end is 1/3 on average. But it's true that again, the capital regions are those where we are closer to the maximum. Where there is the significant, in the case of Portugal, there is the most significant difference across regions is between Lisbon and all the other regions. Does it mean that the regions with lower remote working potential will decline? Not necessarily. I mean, we saw that. I mean, there are many aspects to consider, and there are sectors that can be hit more than others from the pandemic. Sectors that, even if it's not if they are not amenable to remote working, they can continue also during the pandemic. It's true that when you mentioned the islands, these are specific places that rely on tourism a lot. And what we observe is that and everybody knows that the tourism has been dramatically hit during the last year. But I mean, the summer touristic destination are definitely suffering, but capital regions and tourism in capitals is also suffering. As I mentioned at some point, we have I mean, initial evidence to say that actually the highest reduction in tourism happened in the capitals rather than in the summer destinations. So just to make the answer short, I mean, it will be a factor, an important factor to consider, remote working, but whether there will be other factors that will make it difficult for us to look at the future of those specific regions that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. There seem to be quite a few questions coming now on remote working. So there's a question by EPPC. So it's EPPC, if you are there, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Paolo?
Hi, it's Alison Hunter. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hello, Alison. Nice to see you. Nice to hear you.
Hi, Andres. Hi. Nice to see you. Thanks very much for a fantastic presentation. To be honest, I was typing the question as you were speaking, and I think you've kind of answered it. I was just a bit concerned about if we have too much of a focus on remote working being a proxy for future resilience and growth when we are still in relative life support. In terms of the number of people who are remote working right now, and we don't really know how things are going to change in the future vis-a-vis those regions, for example, who are more who are the more tourist service-driven industries where they don't have that capacity for remote working. So I guess I would, like you, caution against looking too much at building more resilience in that space when it may not be needed in the future.
No, I fully agree. I mean, we shouldn't interpret remote working as too strongly. On the other hand, remote working could be seen. So why did we focus so much on remote working? Not just because of its potential to act as a buffer, as an element of resilience during the pandemic. But because the remote working is an aspect that is probably, because we don't know the future, but it's probably going to stay for to a certain level. No, I mean, it will be difficult to imagine a future that will be as before the pandemic. There will be more use of remote working. And this has potential implications in terms of spatial, let's say, trends and opportunities for people. There are actually now, even at UCD, we are investigating these possible relationships, but I mean, there are many studies going on, for example, looking at whether remote working open new opportunities for places that didn't have those opportunities before, whether these opportunities will come for places that are at the outskirts of large cities, or instead more remote places that have that can be attractive. So in a sense, the existence of remote working as a more mass phenomenon that is more spread and more that becomes more common can, at least at the margin, let's say, trigger some movement, some changes, and some new opportunities for places that, if they have certain conditions in place, or the basic an economic base that is strong, or the environmental conditions and well-being aspects that are attractive, in a sense, that can be potentially a factor of, let's say, that represent an advantage for those places, or for example, places that are at the outskirts of large cities, so can be attractive when remote working will become, in a sense, if it stays, can become a source of a factor to look at to understand regional disparities in the future. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Paolo, and thank you very much, Alison. When you ask questions, may I ask you to also turn on your cameras so we can see who's asking the question, which is always nice there. You mentioned one of the issues that had an impact on the differences in excess mortality during the pandemic was the preparedness of health systems. And there's a question by Andoni Montes on the differences in that preparedness, not just across countries, but within countries. So Andoni, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask about the case of the centralized countries. You've mentioned that in some countries there are differences in terms of healthcare service quality, for example, in the amount of beds, hospital beds across regions were really different within regions in the same country. And I wanted to ask you if you've looked into the particular case of the centralized countries, because maybe some would like we would expect to find larger differences in the centralized countries than in different, like more centralized countries like France or Poland, for example. Have you looked into this? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a good point. Actually, no, we haven't looked at the difference between more centralized and more decentralized countries. Our analysis doesn't look very much, doesn't distinguish countries, types of countries. That we consider country fixed effect. So we consider all the unobserved characteristics of countries, but we focus only at the regional level. But this is a possible, angle at which to look at the problem, let's say at the research question. So we haven't done it so far.
Thank you very much, Paolo. There's a question by Annie Tubaji, which is links your past research on migration to the excess mortality related to COVID and the potential rise in inequality. Annie, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Paolo?
Hello, Andres. Hello, Paolo. I was thinking about migration in terms of a really important factor, which normally moves together with all the factors that you presented about, right? So inequality, trust in institutions, social capital, and so on and so forth. But now there are also fear incentives and family relations incentives. So people would be tempted to go back. And this really couples so interestingly with this remote work opportunity, because people can leave the place but continue working somewhere. Certainly from anecdotal evidence, I know a lot of colleagues who did that. A German colleague.
Porque tiene que contestar.
So to what extent this has been already documented with data, and also what will be the link of resilience tomorrow in relation to the interaction of these things? Migration, the other factors of economic development that we know from the past related to it, and the new opportunity for remote working. Have you looked, and do you plan to look into these things?
Thank you, Annie, for the question. This is not easy to answer in a sense. First of all, regarding migration, let me mention that we have done a specific focus on the migrant population during the COVID, and we actually, rather than focusing on people who left actually the region to go to their own countries, we looked at the role of migrants during the pandemic, and we saw that, for example, a very large share of migrants were acted as key workers. So during the lockdowns, they were particularly specific, mainly in cities. They were very, I mean, the migrant population played a key role in terms of ensuring the continuing of key occupations, especially in terms of healthcare, but also in other occupations. And also that given the specific peculiar spatial patterns of migrants, which tend to, compared to the native population, that tend to be more concentrated in cities, they actually also faced, in a sense, worse conditions. So they were lived in places that on average experienced higher mortality rates, higher excess mortality. Regarding so these are aspects that we considered. Regarding instead whether the migrants left because of the remote working potential, we didn't look at this. Even if I suspect, let's say, if we adopt a forward-looking perspective on regional disparities and we want to see and to reflect on the future, I think it would be safer to imagine a future in which remote working is spread and is present, but it will be more on a mixed base. So at least part of the physical presence will be possible. Therefore, we need to see whether this phenomenon really to leave the country to go to another countries would reach numbers that are important, but we have not yet done such estimations.
Okay, thank you. I'm becoming conscious of the time, but I cannot avoid asking a question because I think it's you're highlighting a lot of contradicting trends in many ways, and the role of cities. You clearly highlight something that was put forward by Richard Florida here, that it's likely to be the big cities that are going to emerge stronger from the pandemic. That's what came out from your last slides. But you also had slides indicating that, on the one hand, that activity and transportation within these large cities was clearly below normal, that in metropolitan areas in a country like the UK, we're talking about in a city like London, about 30 to 40% less commuting into the city. In a country like Spain, a city like Madrid, we were talking about higher than the Spanish average, 10%, around 20%. And on top of that, you came out with this idea that these are the places where you can remote work the most. Many have seen that as an opportunity for many areas that were declining, many areas that were losing population, to actually attract those high-flying workers from the big metropolis. What are we going to see? Are we going to see much greater concentration of economic activity, or because of this trends, then the discovery that we can have better quality of life if we decide to work rather than from the center of London, from Portugal or from Valencia or from somewhere else in rural, let's say, Tuscany? Are we going to see a revival of places that for a long time had been declining, losing population, and were deemed to matter less than they mattered before?
That's the $1 million question. Thanks. No, thanks, Andres, first of all, to have highlighted the fact that I presented different, in a sense, contradicting trends, because that's wanted to be honest and highlighting the complexity of, from our perspective, of the issue of the regional disparities. So we cannot mask that complexity. There are different forces and different factors, I mean, pushing in different directions. And now, on the, I mean, whether there will be remote working, let's say, whether remote working will provide opportunities to, let's say, rural Tuscany or other attractive places, I think so. Frankly, I think that there will be opportunities, but again, it will depend on to what extent the remote working will be really what numbers there will be, what will be the actual number of remote working people who can remote working 100%. Before, I mean, having an idea or a measure of the magnitude of these opportunities, I mean, that will emerge. I think that what we are probably, I would be more comfortable to say about this type of aspects is that, I mean, large cities will not, it will not be the end of large cities. That's in that respect, I agree with Richard Florida, of course. Maybe what we can see with the remote working potential is that, especially in cities that are not particularly attractive in their city centers, I mean, the commuting areas, because here we are talking about OECD countries, so developed countries which have already very structured shape of metropolitan areas with large commuting areas that often represent 30% of the workers that live in the metropolitan areas. So those areas might expand a little bit, might spread even more, or concentrate more population that can move from the city center towards the more kind of, you can also call it a rural periphery, but still in locations that are accessible, where jobs and services are accessible on a very easily, rather than just consider only the remote places. Remote places might have new opportunities, that's for sure. But I think that if the first type of change that I would expect would be that potential, at least at the margin, redistribution of the metropolitan population towards high quality and attractive suburbs. This is also what there are a number of studies already looking at housing price, and that they detect some trends that in the suburbs are doing well in this moment.
Thank you very much. And don't get me wrong, I like complexity, and the world is complex, so we need to understand that complexity. Last question from me, because before I pass the baton to Juan to do the closure, but are we going to go back to normal? And if so, when? Or has the pandemic changed us completely and forever? Are we going to live in a completely or relatively different world from the one we were living pre-2020?
That's very hard to answer. That's very hard. I hope that I mean, we are looking at the vaccination rates are going fast, and we hope that I mean, that at least there is the potential to go back to more normal lives. Personally, I mean, if you look at, I think many of us are starting to look to see the lights at the end of the tunnel. But still, I think that what we lived in terms of the issues we have been discussing, again, remote working, for example, the importance of digital connectivity, will stay as particularly, will remain particularly important. So what I think this pandemic change is the adoption, is the speed of technological adoption by many people that would have happened anyway, but that happened suddenly in a much faster way. So it will be a different, in a sense, we shifted towards another equilibrium, or we are shifting to another equilibrium much faster than what we imagined before the pandemic. So there will be some differences with respect to the past. Yeah, sorry if the answer was not. So
well, thank you very much, Paolo. I think this was an excellent presentation, an excellent discussion. I hope that everyone will join me in a virtual sort of applause. It's a pity that we cannot do it personally, but it was a pleasure having you with us in this last session of the Cañada Blanch Forum 2021, and look forward to your future research on this topic. So before closing, I'm going to pass the baton to Juan Viña at the Fundación Cañada Blanch, who is going to give the final words for closure for this sessions.
Okay, thank you very much, Andres. Just 3 very short notes. One, I want to say that the 3 lectures of the workshop will be available at the Fundación Cañada Blanch YouTube channel, and they will be available at the end of May, of this month. And to be more precisely, it will be available on the 27th. So everybody who are interested in following again this workshop, or to get information in a more relaxed way, they can do it, I repeat, in our Fundación Cañada Blanch YouTube channel. The second thing is I want to thank the managing director of the foundation, Paula Sanchez, for her fantastic work, helping Andres on everything and taking care of everything at this forum. And the third thing is just thank you very much to people attending us, and thank you very much on the Board of Trustees and on my name to Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose for this fantastic workshop. Andres, we're very proud to have you as a very important person of our foundation and for holding the chair Princesa de Asturias at the LSE and being the director of our center. Thank you very much for everybody. Good evening for everybody in Europe, and for those in America, good morning. Thank you.